Matthew Krayton, thank you so much for making time to come on our little show.
Thanks for having me.
So you played a key role in creating President Biden's "We Just Did" hat campaign, and as I understand it, that hat's message is like a play on Donald Trump's Make America Great Again" slogan. With politics as they are, I suspect some Trump supporters and probably critics of Biden might have viewed that hat as kind of gloating or divisive. Especially given the contentious nature of that election and its aftermath. Some might have even seen it as an unnecessary provocation. And that's political merchandise and slogans often have to walk that fine line between rallying supporters and potentially alienating their opponents. And in the broader context, that stuff is common, but it can also contribute to polarization of the electorate. So, in your experience working with campaigns, do campaigns consciously decide between being unifying or divisive with their messaging, or is the focus primarily on effectiveness and engagement?
Well, that's a good question. So I think there's always a desire to. Well, I shouldn't say that. I should speak for the campaigns that I've had the opportunity to work on. So I think the goal, at least I've been fortunate enough to work on campaigns where the overriding goal is to develop and deploy a unifying message, right? Because I don't think division necessarily serves the country in a way that that creates productive dialogue around policy, around trying to move different things forward. That being said, I think there are elements of having to draw a contrast between the two choices, right? Because like all elections are about choices. So either pick candidate A or candidate B. And voters need to understand what the difference between those two candidates are. Oftentimes, the ways in which, as voters, we evaluate different candidates. It's both from a policy perspective, sure, but then there's also an emotional component too. I mean, human beings are emotional beings, right? Like we kind of it's sort of an evolutionary thing, right? Like you kind of have these shortcuts embedded in our brains that enable us to process the vast amount of information that we're confronted with in any given moment, and a large part of that is emotional. Is how do we feel about this, whatever it is, message or a particular development or piece of news, and then we react to that. So to answer your question, I think the goal for the most part is to be more at least on the Democratic side. So I'll just I mean, obviously I work on the Democratic side of the aisle, so like I would say like the goal more often than not is to unite people and is to bring people into the tent that we've built. So the Democratic Party is truly a big tent party at this point, and I think that tent has only gotten bigger as we've moved through the 2016 election and into the 2020 election. In the 2024 election, again, we'll see, how that all shakes out. But as it relates to merchandise and different things like that, I think you do want to try to strike a balance between whether it's merchandise, collateral, other things, strike a balance between again having that unifying vision, but then also speaking to whatever subset of voters you're trying to speak to on the terms dictated essentially by the platforms that are available to us, right? So, I think there's a very specific or a variety of ways that you can communicate with people via social media, for example, that are it's different than it used to be, right? So, like, I think if you think back to the days of like Walter Cronkite, right? Like people would have a lot of their news filtered through folks like that or through newspapers or other means. Now, you're communicating directly with voters. And, I think as a campaign, like as a practitioner in a campaign, you really need to develop an understanding of what people are going to react to, what they're going to share, what sorts of things they're going to identify with or relate to. So you have to think through different aspects of what that means, and oftentimes it means using humor for certain to get certain messages across to your target audience. So as it relates to that hat, actually, it was sort of an accidental viral sort of sensation. So it was, I don't want to say an inside joke, but it was meant to be sort of a subtle nod to the very sort of intense, polarizing message of make America great again. And I think if you kind of deconstruct what that means, that's the thing that we were sort of responding to in that moment. It's like make it great again. What does that actually mean? Like what period of time are we going back to? And what does that mean for the various constituencies or people in this country, right? So if you go back to certain periods of time in American history, I think objectively we can all agree that like it wasn't so good for different groups of people. So like if we're talking about like going back to something or some nostalgia for a better era, I think we need to be very clear-eyed about what we're talking about and what we mean and what slogans like that mean. Like take back our country. Well, from who? Take it back to where? Make it great again. How? So I think those are the questions that you sort of had in your mind, but it wasn't actually really meant to be a kind of trolly thing. It was sort of a celebratory. We had just been through one of the most unique and honestly stressful campaign cycles in modern history, right? Because we were not only dealing with tremendous upheaval in this country, but also a deadly pandemic in 2020. And I think looking back to that, it was an entirely different campaign than you would be used to in previous cycles, right? Like 2016 was much different. 2020 was just a completely different animal altogether. So I think it was sort of a more of a celebratory thing of hey, let's just make this hat and we'll have a little bit of fun because at the end of the day, um, the stakes have, at least in my view, of these elections have gotten progressively higher since 2016. Obviously, we saw what the impact of 2016 was, and not to get too political, but again, and your listeners will know where I'm coming from, so they can evaluate what I'm saying, based on my biases that I come to. But I think that the stakes have become progressively greater to the point where you do lose a little bit of fun in the process. So that was sort of, I think, the idea behind the hat and having a little bit of fun there was okay. Let's just celebrate a little bit. It was exhausting. The vote counting was exhausting. The actual campaign was exhausting. So let's pop a cork and have some fun.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, it's kind of amazing how kind of much we forget, the tumult that was going on back then, right? And now we seem like we just well, and I get it. Like it's natural for humans to not want to sort of talk about when bad things happen. Like we kind of don't want to think about it. Like, and at some point we have to kind of. I mean, this happened in the 20s, right? I mean, we kind of never. World War One, millions of people were killed. Then there was a pandemic then, right? And this was never really like people just wanted to move on. Like you had the Roaring Twenties and flappers and all that sort of stuff.
Mhm.
Um, and I think we're a little bit like that now. Like we don't want to remember what it was like. You know, we just want to pretend that we're just in a normal horse race or whatever, or that, and we don't want to kind of remember what that was like. And I and maybe there's certainly a group that longs for that again because they were energized by some of that I don't know, chaos for lack of a better term, but certainly a lot of the unpredictability that we're kind of energized by it. There's definitely a segment that kind of wants that back, but it seems like we sort of forget some of that and how much we were in need of a kind of a release and a calming effect. But then now we're bored by it, I guess.
I guess, yeah. I mean, yeah, it is interesting to kind of look at the chaos and I don't want to say like entertainment value, but they're almost. I mean, I think that's sort of where again it's very anxiety provoking, but at the same time it also it creates a situation where people tune in a way that maybe they wouldn't necessarily tune into politics, right? Because again, like people by and large don't pay attention to politics day to day, right? It's just not something that most people do. And can you blame them, right? There are a million different things to worry about in life. Putting food on your table, getting the kids to soccer practice, going to work, dealing with all of your responsibilities. But I think when there's this sort of like abnormal kind of chaos or what feels abnormal, it does like draw people into it and it's sort of maybe the same reason that people like to go on roller coasters or like other sort of thrill rides like that. Is like there's that nervousness also like provides like a little, I don't know, entertainment. I don't know. So it is an interesting concept. And I would argue that boring is probably better for the country, honestly. If we're a little bored, like that means that things are running smoothly. You're not up at night thinking about what might happen. Like having a steady hand at the controls, I think is fundamentally boring, but also comforting for me personally. But like again, I could see why there's some sense that people want to have that excitement, have that kind of entertainment in their politics. And it's because that's sort of how our media environment is set up too, right? Because if it's not entertaining, then you're not going to tune in. So it's like that. That's why shows get canceled, right? Because people aren't watching it, and it's not interesting. And there's in some cases not enough conflict or tension in the plot to keep people invested in it. So it's definitely an interesting sort of push and pull, because yes, you want people to pay attention, but also you don't want to have a circus every day.
Hmm. Yeah, I think we were burnt out by it back then, and now we just kind of forget what that felt like, and yeah. So let's move on to technology a little bit. I know you have a lot to say about this, and I don't know, you may or may not know. Some of my audience knows that I have a tech background, and I'm not a full-on AI expert, but I try to keep my eye on what's going on there, and have a lot of contacts and other from that space. And you see a lot of folks are concerned about AI's potential impact on political messaging, and you see a lot of concern about deep fakes and impersonation and things like that. And those are certainly legitimate concerns, but I always think about sort of other kinds of things, some of these kind of things that aren't getting the same kind of attention. And with this show, I've certainly learned that we're as humans, and you even were talking about this a little bit, we're just super sensitive to these generic emotional triggers, that we see in these campaign blasts. Um, Imagine, sort of this world where these could be super hyper personalized emotional things that hit on our like deepest personal insecurities, and AI could track our routine and our emotional signals, and then choose times when they send the most outrage inducing, highly personalized stuff when we're most vulnerable. um, and that kind of stuff, and that's just one example. I mean, I think you can come up with a lot more, but of course, then before we get too carried away on the fear side and everybody's thinking about jumping off the ledge, I also personally think that this technology has a lot of potential. It has a lot of potential to be part of the solution. So with that as kind of food for thought, I know you put a lot of fair bit of thought into this, and maybe you can just highlight some of what you think are some of the important things we should know with respect to AI and emerging technologies, and how it could potentially safeguard democracy or contribute to fueling outrage and division, obviously, particularly in this context of political campaigns.
Yeah, absolutely. So I totally agree that like I think there are elements of this that people aren't talking about that might be even more frightening than deep fakes, and things like that. But to start with the sort of sunny side of the equation, I do think that there is a role for AI and emerging technologies, if used correctly, to help further our conversations around policy and solve some of the big issues that we face as a country, right? So, like from a policy perspective, it can be very helpful in trying to develop, ideas and policy prescriptions that are effective, that are palatable to the electorate in a way that helps us deal with a lot of the big issues that we're facing. So, like climate change, for example, I think there's a lot of possibility there to better understand, energy efficiency, or how to reduce emissions, or come up with better ways to capture emissions, perhaps. So, like, I think there's a lot of upside in places like that, or healthcare, for example, where we have this healthcare system in this country that has gotten markedly better over the last couple of years, and access to affordable care has certainly improved since the Affordable Care Act was passed and has been implemented. So, there more people are insured today than were, 10, 15 years ago, which I think is a huge, um, huge benefit. But we have this system in this country where our healthcare system is geared toward treating sick people, right? Not preventing illness, right? So I think there's a lot of upside in figuring out through AI. Well, how can we actually reduce the cost of healthcare by simply having a better picture of how to treat disease and keep people healthy before they get to a place where they have some sort of catastrophic health issue. Now, are you going to catch every single thing? Of course not. But like I think there are ways in which AI could be integrated within healthcare to help bolster that. And that's just one example with that, or efficiency in transportation. Being able to catalog and better understand the condition of various infrastructure in the country, right? So like I think there are all sorts of applications where AI can help strengthen the policy environment. Now, in terms of like in the electoral sphere, that picture to me is not as clear about how you would use AI to strengthen democracy, because I think democracy, by and large, is or at least our conception of democracy in this country, is contingent upon this agreement that we have with each other that we are going to elect people every 2 years in the House, every 6 years in the Senate, every 4 years for president, and then whatever local offices you have. So we're going to elect people. We're all going to go out. We're going to vote. We're going to make our choices. Those people are going to pursue the policy agendas for the most part, or in some cases that they talked about in the campaign trail. There may be changes, but as citizens, we pay attention to that. We see what they do in office, and then we vote again when those terms are up, and we decide to keep them or decide to vote new people in, and then we all abide by the results of those elections. In addition to that, too, this agreement that for the most part, I think we want government to play a fairly limited role in our personal lives as well, right? Like, and I think that's an agreement that we can have. So, and I think that's a part of democracy, right? Where you can, for example, make your own healthcare decisions, and those things are not being pushed on you by government or being restricted by government or law or things like that. So I think in those places, in sort of the pure democracy space, it's all contingent upon our agreement as citizens in this country that we are going to abide by this structure, that we are going to honor the results of elections, that we are going to try to have a government that I think provides for its citizens, but does not interfere with the citizens' ability to make very personal decisions, very private decisions in their lives. So, in terms of AI, like I don't necessarily see how it strengthens the ability or strengthens that agreement that we have with each other. And I think, what it ultimately comes down to is like we have to decide as a society that this is what we want still, that however imperfect our democracy is, and believe me, it's imperfect. Our institutions are not perfect. Our elected officials do not make perfect decisions. People make mistakes along the way. Certain policies don't work out, right? But at the end of the day, the alternative is having someone who's just going to tell you what to do, and it's going to be their way or the highway. And I don't think that's very attractive. So I don't see how AI necessarily strengthens that. I mean, I'd be open to ideas on what that looks
Well,
like.
yeah, I mean, some of the things I've seen some projects like this, examples, and I've also just had kicked around ideas. I think one place you can do that is by improving, those dialogues and understandings, right? I mean, one of the problems with, I'm really focused on this toxic polarization problem because as long as that exists, we can't do a lot of what democracy needs, which is getting in a room with people you don't like very much and hashing things out because we just now are voting on hate or really real serious animosity towards the other side, and that's all we really vote on, and then we don't encourage our representatives to try to work together. So I think there's ideas like prompts that could help educate about all those things you just said. Like I'm going to make this Facebook post, and this AI could sort of say, hey, you know what, this is, there's two things here that are like exaggerating the reality. Like Democrats really don't think like that. Republicans, not all Republicans think like that. Oh, the democratic institutions of our country that have been, around for a couple hundred years, would see this as this way, like, almost like teaching civics and also just teaching some, you know, lowering the hostile language and maybe just, cooling off the temperature on some of this thought because this, so I think there is opportunities there and studies have shown this works. The social media companies don't want to implement this kind of stuff because it hurts their bottom line because now they want that divisive rhetoric because it keeps people engaged. So, we actually but I think there's opportunities for us as, you know, citizens to take this technology and do it. The question is, do we have the will, sort of what you're hinting at? Do we have the will to do it? And a big problem there is appreciating the problem, right? Right now, I talk to a lot of people, just average people, not just all these experts I talk to, but I talk to average people, and the biggest blind spot that you see is, everybody sort of says roughly a similar kind of thing. Like I'm against the vitriol. I would like it to cool off because the other side does blah, blah, blah. Like they can't see it when it's their side doing it. They can't see it when it's themselves doing it. Like at the same time, they'll say, I want to lower the rhetoric. They'll say, something really bad about an opponent or about a candidate or about somebody who's on the other side, right? So I think there's opportunity there for AI to softly like nudge in all those directions to help us help us become more informed about all the things you just said, right? I mean, that why free and fair elections matter, why agreeing that the winner won and we accept the outcome of that election, why that stuff is important to, and why the opposite is so dangerous and potentially, it's never worked. Like historically, when people have tried those things, it hasn't gone well. So, and it's really hard to build these institutions that we have. So I think there's opportunities like that for AI to jump in, and how you do that and how you exactly achieve it is difficult. But I mean, I think there's lots of places where there's almost like a Grammarly type component in your PC that will catch when you're saying stuff and just kind of give you, hey, you're kind of being disrespectful, or this could be seen as hostile, or this could be seen as, and maybe you want to tone it down, or maybe you don't, I don't know, but here's kind of, and you're exaggerating this point or that kind of stuff. I think there's opportunity there for AI to play in that. And, people are using this stuff, starting to use this stuff for everything now. That should be an option.
Yeah, I mean, so I would, I think in a perfect world that makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
So and generally, so like I am very disposed to being an optimist, right? Like I think at my core, I am a very optimistic person. Um, but I would exercise a little pessimism about whether or not something like that could work. And the reason I say that is we have, to your point, about this, social media platforms, implementing, some of these tools. And I think, there have been various attempts at trying to tamp down at least disinformation or misinformation, things that are intentionally inflammatory and false. And I think the results of that have been a mixed bag, deeply imperfect, and quite frankly, probably hasn't prevented the worst of what we have going on in terms of, again, misinformation, disinformation. But I think the sort of more pessimistic view is like if we're living in. So I've seen a lot of admirable civic tech startups, right, that are trying to get into the space of like, well, if we just have a platform or the tools, then and we can get this in front of people, then we'll be able to educate people. They'll be able to evaluate policy in a way that's more measured, more level-headed. And make it about the issues as opposed to the people, as opposed to the D versus R type dynamic. And unfortunately, I have not seen many of them succeed over the years. And the problem is there's just not a ton of demand to use this stuff. Like, do we want to layer in an additional thing that we have to pay attention to in our daily lives? And I think there's a lot of friction between that, where we're already using these social media platforms. do we need to layer in something else? We're already watching Netflix. We're already watching Hulu. We have cable. We have Spotify. We have all sorts of stuff. We have basically what amounts to a supercomputer in our pockets, right? That can deliver information at any given time. So I think, like from what I've seen in the past, there's been a lot of friction to adoption of those civic tech platforms that are meant to help educate people, which makes it a little bit more difficult. Also, I think too the types of people that end up using those platforms are the ones that are pretty plugged in anyway and fairly informed on that. So I think that makes it a little harder to use AI in that context. Just being realistic, and to your point about will, and I think it's like, do we have the will to do this? Is there a demand for it? And again, I think in principle there is a demand for these things, but does that rise to, or does it have the salience that it needs to in order for there to be widespread enough adoption of these technologies or platforms or opportunities to learn about policy positions, or even kind of like, again, tamping down some of the worst of what we have out there in terms of, again, misinformation, disinformation, to really make an impact materially for our democracy. So I do worry a little bit about that in using AI. On the flip side of that too, I think some of this is a fundamentally human issue, right? And we know that there are certain techniques and certain ways of talking to people that will yield better results, but it's very labor intensive. And it does require a human connection. Now, I'm not saying that might not change, right? As AI improves and becomes more human-like than it already is, we may have a situation where you can have these deeper conversations with people at a scale that makes an impact. I think that is a possibility. But I think, again, on a fundamental level, breaking down some of these barriers requires that human conversation and understanding that folks can relate to each other in ways that might be unexpected. So, for example, when a lot of the debates were raging around marriage equality, a lot of groups went out and engaged in this technique called deep canvassing. So, deep canvassing is a technique that essentially it's not, so typically when you're canvassing doors during a political campaign or issues campaign, ballot initiative, you're going to go to the door, you're going to read the script like, oh, I'm here with the such and such campaign. Here are the 5 bullet points that I want you to hear. Can I count on your vote on Tuesday, right? And most of the time, that it's effective, but like if you're at a door where someone is skeptical or does not support that candidate, that's not going to get it done, right? So deep canvassing is, let's find some common ground between the two of us and talk about that first as a way into talking about other things. So, for example, in the marriage equality campaigns that took place, so folks would go to the door and be like, "Hey, I live down the street. My kids go to X such and such school. I work at the factory, down the street too. And there's some common ground there. Oh, I work in the factory too. We work hard for a living. We want to put food on the table for our families, blah, blah, blah." Well, that's great. Like, we agree on that. That's awesome. We have a lot in common there. So, the difference though for me is that my family is a little bit different than your family, right? In that, like, I want to be able to get married to my partner, but I can't right now. We have the same values, the same things that we want to do in life, same aspirations, the same, we're reaching for the same, American dream. You've been able to get married. That's great. Very happy for you. I want that opportunity too. Can we count on your support? So, like, getting to that place where you find all that common ground. It's like, oh, our kids go to the same school. Oh, we work in a similar industry and like have a similar lived experience. Oh, well, maybe you're not so different. Maybe this isn't so scary. And then we can support this. So, like, I think that does actually require, turning the temperature down a little bit, does require some human conversation. If you look at the worst of sort of like our current political situation, it's that people are deeply afraid of each other. deeply afraid of each other. And simply because they just don't know personally or don't feel like they know personally the people that they feel are taking something from them, right? So we have these like very tribal kind of instincts as human beings. Again, we try to fall into groups that we feel comfortable with, that we feel will protect us, that have similar lived experiences. Well, as it turns out, the person who lives in a city, maybe I live on a farm and someone lives in the city, 50 miles away from me. They might have a very similar lived experience, but I'm scared of them because I just don't know. I don't know those things about them. I don't know what values we share. I don't know, what sort of struggles we share potentially. So like those are really interesting things that I think require a bit of a human connection, that I'm not sure. And again, it may get to a point where AI can amplify those things and can be used to scale those conversations. Right now, I'm not convinced of it.
Well, and it's a little worse than that too, in that not only do we not know, we actually make all these assumptions based on all these signals we often don't even know we're doing. They wear this
Sure.
color, they drive this kind of car, they do this or that, and now we're going to sort of bolt on all these things we assume about them that most of which are probably wrong.
Yeah, yes, absolutely. And again, like you've seen it in this presidential campaign that's about to wrap up, where all this stuff that was going on with the rumors around the Haitian American communities in like Columbus, Ohio, for example. I mean, yes, like no one wants their pets to be in danger or jeopardy, right? Like I think universally we can all agree in that, but like that wasn't happening, right? And all of a sudden that's being ascribed to a certain set of people, a certain community, people's neighbors, right? Like these are your neighbors and people that you run into in the street, you run into in the grocery store, and all of a sudden, you have this group of people who are being vilified, based on completely false information, and suddenly it starts to spread, and that fear is dangerous. The fear is dangerous because if you feel like there is actually a fundamental threat, like again, we are programmed to fall back to our tribes, to the people who we feel like we're going to protect the people that we love, we're going to protect the tribes that we identify with. And if you hear like people are capturing and killing like pets in a city. Yes, of course that's going to sound scary. It's completely false though, and it's very frightening, and it's honestly been weaponized in a way that's disturbing because again, it is a very slippery slope from simply saying those things and being angry about it on social media to then inciting violence against certain communities in this country, right? Because I think it just builds on itself, and there are certain people, unfortunately, that will feel like violence is the only antidote to these sorts of things. Violence, physically violence, verbally violence on social media, and I think that's a very scary place to be in, is when we're othering people in this country who are actually, if you go into those communities and talk to those folks, very similar to you and I, to people who live all the way across the country. Again, they're here to reach for the American dream, just in the way that you are, and it doesn't have to be a zero sum game. And I think that's the thing. It's like we view this as a zero sum game, and then we start, like you said, bolting on these different sort of pieces of false information in certain cases that make it very scary to kind of engage with those folks, and then propels like this really toxic environment that doesn't help anybody. So I I think we have to be very mindful of what all of that does, and I genuinely think that the people who are perpetrating those lies and those falsehoods, and again vilifying groups of people in this country and othering people, I mean, they know what they're doing, right? And I think in some cases the goal is violence, unfortunately, and it's very scary for our democracy and for everyone in this country.
Well, and even yeah, well, and then as you mentioned before, there's always the supply and demand problem. I mean, there's always that demand. We often talk more about the supply problem than demand problem, but demand is a big problem too. But in terms of that othering, I mean, I'm just like everybody else. I'm receiving a lot of this campaign stuff, and I kind of stay involved in it just kind of as a research instrument. I like to see all those as data points. What are people saying? And there's a heavy reliance on othering, right? I mean, most of the messages are sort of an us or them theme, or even going further and the other side's evil. And, you know, and and it doesn't seem like there's much concern for what the long-term effects of that feeding into that toxic division are. Like they just want to use it now and weaponize it now. And that's true for campaigns on Democrats, for Democrats and Republicans. I mean, have you seen an example where somebody has sort of succeeded resisting that urge and kind of avoiding that messaging and still managed to engage and mobilize supporters?
So I think yes. Um, but I think we also have to be careful. And again, your listeners understand where I'm coming from. So like they, again, can evaluate perhaps the bias that I have. But I genuinely think that I'm coming at this from a fairly objective point of view. In this case, I think we have to be careful in conflating the falsehoods that are spread by certain people, again, like this the stuff in Columbus, Ohio, or like vilifying again communities in the United States, with pointing out what I feel, and I think a lot of Americans feel, are objectively frightening threats to the fabric of our democracy, right? So like I think that there is actually value, and it is warranted, and I think we have to talk about it. Talk about the fact that like our democracy, again, in my view, is very much under threat, and right now, there is one party, in my view, that is pushing that forward, right? So like again, I think what's happened since 2016, we have, and like even January 6th, right? Like looking at January 6th as an event, like I don't think that as a country, if you went back to right before election day in 2016, let's say, that we could have ever conceived of the fact that an angry mob would have stormed the Capitol, violent angry mob would have stormed the Capitol in an attempt to overturn a free, secure, and fair election. And so and you don't really see that though from the other side, right? Like you don't see that much from Democrats saying like, hey, we have to like storm the Capitol. Like, and so I think yes, there are
Well, what I'll say
one-off
though is that by
instances.
telling people day in and day out that they're terrible and they're not good and they're deplorable. I mean, that's how they read it. I'm just kind of saying this kind of stuff, right? From their
Mhm.
perspective, this kind of stuff starts being justified. I mean, obviously they're circulating this kind of like you say, both sides do this exaggeration, but I mean within their side, they're circulating these sort of exaggerated stories of how bad the left is. And it starts to become you start to justify these kind of behaviors because you become certain of how evil the other side is. And I don't think, I mean, I agree with you that the Republican elite, the actual those in power have sort of bought into a lot of this more than the Democratic side so far has. I believe in the Democratic populace, they're on the same edge. They would probably start going for that. You see people talk about this stuff. If there was, but so far, the Democratic elites have sort of pushed back from that, going, yeah, we're not letting that kind of thing sort of dominate our party. But I think as a populace, because we send these messages about how terrible the other side is, both sides are kind of ready for that, then they would probably buy into it if someone was able to capture the Democratic Party in the way that people have kind of captured the Republican Party. Um, and so, I think yes, I totally agree that there are differences in some of these the magnitude of some of these things, and have to be a little careful about the both sidesism. But and like I say, this capturing of the Republican Party has definitely happened. That hasn't happened with it, and that's what's kind of keeping the Democratic Party from this turning into just a all-out civil war. But I think that messaging is building up this has created the environment for all that to happen, right? I mean, these people believe these narratives. We tell ourselves these narratives, we believe it, and I think Democrats believe it as much as not the elite, but the regular populace believe it as much as Republicans do. And, they and Republicans see Democrats as a democratic threat too. They just think it means different things, right? Um, you know, uh, yeah, but yeah, I mean, I guess I'm having a hard time getting, but I think we're sort of agreeing, but I also think that we have to be a little careful to say it's all just one side. I mean, I think the Democrats the electorate are just as ready for that kind of stuff as the Republicans as an electorate are. But like I say, the Republican side has been captured a little bit more by folks buying into that more than the Democrats have. The Democrats have resisted it so far.
Right. I think we are agreeing, and I think it's a very important point of looking at it's really like I don't think that we could lay this at the feet of the voters generally speaking, right? Like on the Republican side of things, and you've actually heard it from a number of people who stormed the Capitol on January 6th in their trials and interviews afterwards, where they essentially did that and then realized afterwards, like, wait a second, I just did a horrible thing, and I feel like I'm being lied to. And in fair, I mean, again, I'm very like anti-violence across the board. I don't think anyone, I mean, political violence is bad for democracy, period. No matter who's
Right.
doing it,
Right.
bad for whatever
Right.
purpose, like bad,
Right.
bad, bad. We don't want that in this
Yeah.
country. But
And
I do think that we saw, like, we can't lay it at the feet of voters to the extent that, again, in a perfect world, should we be just evaluating policy positions and trying to figure out what the best direction for the country is? Sure. But like, when your leadership, right, your party leadership, the people that you look to for guidance on things are embracing these very extreme, very scary views, especially encouraging violence, it's it's the fault of the leadership ultimately in the party. Like they have the most agency in this situation to lead us in a direction where we say political violence is unacceptable. We accept the results of elections. We make sure that they're free, fair, and secure, but we accept the results of elections. And then we move on. And then in 4 years, if we don't like what's going on, you have another opportunity to vote that person out if you don't like it. And so I think it falls at the feet of the leadership, not the voters, right? So voters, I think, for the most part, are doing the best that they can, and I think, and I agree with you. Like, it's deeply unhelpful to have sort of commentary about, like, baskets of deplorables and things like that. I think genuinely, it's sort of it's rotting from the head is what's happening. So I wouldn't say that, like, I wouldn't lay it at the feet of people who identify with Republicans or identify as more conservative, or even, like, people who identify with Trump, Donald Trump. I would say that it's the responsibility again of the people that are empowered to maintain that or uphold that agreement that we have in this country, that again elections matter and that votes should count, and that I think our goal as a country is to have as many citizens participate in that process as possible, right? Like, I think it's just better if more people participate. And so I think it's up to the leadership, right? So, like, I wouldn't lay it at the feet of, like, the people who make up the party. It's more the leadership that are propelling this forward, and it's up to them to say, like, look, like, we may disagree on all these different policy points, and, like, we may think that some of these things are quite existential in some ways, but at the end of the day, we live in a country where there's majority rule and protection of minority rights,
yeah.
right? So at the end of the day,
Well,
that's
and actually, there's
that's
protection of
yeah,
minorities with the electoral college too. It's not exactly majority rule either. It's not simple majority rule either. I mean, there is protection of these minority states through stuff
it
like the electoral college, and
it is.
that's specific to presidential elections. But we have to be a little careful about saying everything is strictly majority rule.
Yes, I agree with that. And there are different, like, again, safeguards built in where, Senate, every state gets, regardless of size,
Right.
gets, two senators
Exactly.
and,
Yeah.
a variety of, or a varying number of, members of the House. So, like, there are definitely things built in, but, like, I think in general, again, the presidential elections, they kind of set the agenda writ large for the country. And obviously the House and the Senate legislate, and that's how our government works, and Supreme Court does their thing. But I think that in terms of majority rule, like, if whoever wins the presidency, right, usually that's somewhat reflective of what a majority of the country wants from a policy perspective. And at the end of the day, though, too, the people who didn't want that are generally should generally be protected, right? So, like, for example, uh, again, the conversation around reproductive rights. You may feel as a religious person, I'm not saying you, I'm just saying you in the royal sense, but like, people, folks who are religious and simply do not believe that abortion is moral, and maybe flies in the face of their religious beliefs. No one's forced to engage in those behaviors in this country, right? No one's forced to seek that type of healthcare in this country if you don't want it, right? On the flip side of that, people who need it, who want to avail themselves of that care, should be allowed to do so without any problem. So I think both of those things, like, you're allowed to be religious in this country, right? That's part of the fundamental fabric of our Constitution is you are allowed to be religious. You are allowed to live your life by a moral code that is prescribed by your religion if you so choose to do that.
You
So
can
I
pray in
think those
school if
things
you
are
want
kind of
to.
important. You individually can pray in school, absolutely.
Right.
Now, should the school be telling you that you have to pray? Absolutely not. It should
Right.
not. I mean, like, you hear schools like requiring that students, public schools, like, students read the Bible, all of that stuff. I mean, I think that is so detrimental again to if a student wants to bring a Bible to school and read that Bible, throughout the day or whatever, or pray or do what they want. That's great. Everyone should be allowed to do that or not, right? Because this
Right.
is America, and we have a variety of belief systems in this country, and it's a hard and I will say it is a hard thing to do, right? A multi-racial, multi-ethnic, multi-religion, religious or not, society is a hard thing to maintain. It's much easier when you have, a homogenous society where you have a lot of people with similar backgrounds, similar religion, similar. But we've never had that in this country, right? We've been in this sort of evolving mix of things, and it's been a really interesting experiment. And it gets progressively harder as we try to figure out what that means for us as a country. But I think, like, again, if we keep going back to what the fundamentals are, right, is again the majority what the majority of people want in terms of how the government interacts with the economy, interacts with like infrastructure, interacts with business, interacts with healthcare, all of those things. I think we could have a good faith debate about it. I think there's some non-negotiables too. Again, like, the non-negotiables are elections matter, votes matter, and that the rights of people to exist uh, in whatever way, as long as it's not impinging upon anyone else's fundamental rights, is really it should be at the core of this country. I worry that we are losing that a little bit, and we're kind of getting dragged down different rabbit holes. Like, for example, free speech, right? This whole idea that social media platforms are abridging free speech, right? This idea that our fundamental right of free speech is threatened by platforms making decisions to moderate is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. They are private businesses. I could go right now out in the street corner and say something incredibly inflammatory if I want to. No one's going to arrest me. No one's going to stop me from doing that. People may not like it, but that's my cross to bear, right? Like, because I made that decision, right? So we all have agency in this situation. So it's like, so you kind of get dragged down these rabbit holes about stuff that, like, you think is sort of a fundamental discussion around what our democracy means. And it's like, at the end of the day, you're free to say whatever you want for the most part. Again, as long as it's not impinging upon other people's rights or threatening their health and safety. Um, I mean, so, like, having those conversations too about the erosion of free speech and those fundamental rights in the context of social media platforms or other moderated spaces, I think is very detrimental too. So, like, I think we're, again, like, there's a lot of conflation going on in how we think about what really is the fabric of our democracy what does that mean? This idea of like cancel culture, wokeness, right? That's another thing that like drives me absolutely crazy. It's like I got news for you. We live in a capitalist society, and people are going to decide what they want to consume and what they don't want to consume. And if they don't think your jokes are funny, then that's on you, right? That's on you to like if you don't want to have an audience, cool. That great. If you want to have an audience, then you're going to have to find a way to communicate with people in a way that they want to be communicated with. Like I can, it's like selling a product, right? If you have a fundamentally bad product that malfunctions all the time, people aren't going to buy it, right? And that's just simply that's capitalism. So, I think we end up conflating a lot of these different ideas in a way that's very unconstructive and potentially harmful for again, as we think about like what democracy means and how we can prop it up essentially and strengthen it in this country.
Well, yeah, and stuff like having the right to say it. You have the right to say it. That doesn't mean you have. That doesn't mean there's an implied. There's no one's required to distribute it. That message, right? I mean,
Hmm.
you don't have a
Sure.
right to distribution. I mean, you're going to go in the parking lot and say the thing. There's nobody's required to go echo that or go tell a bunch of people that like they're going to either do that or they're not, and it's not you don't have a right that that's going to happen, and that's something else that's gone haywire. There's no right for you to be platformed um,
No,
on
no,
private company.
certainly not. I mean, you can make those decisions. Yeah, 100%. Like you absolutely do not need to be platformed. And again, I think, some of these, billionaires and folks in Silicon Valley are going down a very dangerous path again. And it's this sort of sense of grievance too, especially like if you're one of those people who feel like they can't say what they want to say. Well, guess what? Like you've got your own podcast, not you. I'm just saying like some of these folks have their own podcasts. They have massive audiences. So like why are you telling me you can't say
Right,
certain
right.
things? Like you
There's all this
literally have a
irony.
huge audience.
Yeah.
Yeah. So what are we actually talking about here? And it makes people angry because again, they think that's what's happening, but like the fact that they are sitting in front of you on your screen and you are listening to them and they have those big audiences is evidence that in fact you can say whatever you want and it just some people aren't going to tune in for it and that's okay. But it's incredibly dangerous to suggest that I think that that there's any real effort afoot to stop people from saying what they want to say. I mean, there are consequences to everything. There are consequences to everything. I mean, I could throw my computer out the window right now, and then if I turn around to you and say, "Look, I'm really upset that my computer's broken," you're probably going to ask me why I threw it out the window. Like, why'd you do that? Like, I mean, it just doesn't make any sense, right? So,
Yeah, well, I mean, I think people do get concerned. There was, with those some of those impacts theoretically, what you see with the reporting of the government getting involved and telling Twitter what to take off the platform and stuff, which, obviously there's national security aspects of that that probably do cross a line. But, people I think were sort of saying that that's where it kind of crosses the line on the free speech side if the government is telling Twitter what to remove. But again, that's a whole nother topic, probably for
yeah,
another day.
sure.
Well, and the other end, you bring up all these things that I think of all these ironies. I mean, you see these sort of anarchists have a podcast or something, and they're talking about how, the government won't let me say things. I mean, you're saying them right now. I don't know what you're talking about. Like you're not in jail. You have a podcast. You're saying all these things, and you're not in jail because like we have rule of law, and it's like, and you want, it's like the irony of some of this is kind of wild. So you also teach at Centenary University. Did I have that pronunciation right?
Yeah, Centenary University. Yep.
Centenary University, and you teach in a social media program there. So what advice do you give students about this balancing this kind of influence with responsibility, particularly in high stakes politics?
Yeah, so I actually have taken a couple semesters off, but I was yeah I had been teaching there a few semesters back, and so we've gone through the 2020 election together, and that that was and in the pandemic as well. So that was a really interesting time to be in a social media class, and so I think one of the things that we focused on, and one of the parts that I thought was, so it was a social media strategy course. So a lot of it was sort of nuts and bolts, like how do you get your message out there? How do you use social media as a tool for communication effectively? But, I felt like it was very important to also have a frank conversation around the ethical considerations of using social media and the ethical considerations of pulling certain levers in order to get people or persuade people of a particular viewpoint or even sell a product um, or deliver a political message. And I think from so it was sort of a multifaceted thing. So from a social media consumption perspective, I and this is advice that I give to a lot of people, and I think that we would do really well in this country to have in primary school all the way up, because kids have phones now, right? Like, I'm sort of the generation where we kind of had one foot in, one foot out, right? So like in my younger years, we used to have um, at best, one computer in the house. It was the size of like a refrigerator. I'm
Right.
exaggerating a little bit, but or maybe a microwave, right? And then you have you had dial-up internet. Someone would call the house and you get knocked off, and it barely ever worked anyway. So it was like there was always something wrong with it. To then in high school, college, having access to early smartphones, right? And so kind of got to see both sides of the world. Now kids have access to tablets and phones and all sorts of things from a very young age. And I think what I say is, we would do really well to have a media literacy course or courses or programs in schools to give students an age appropriate context for what happens inside your brain when you're consuming some of these things, right? Because it's just like any other substance, right, that you ingest, for example, that creates a chemical reaction in your brain and you get some sort of feedback from that. So whether that's a dopamine hit um, or serotonin or other sort of things that sort of produce the emotions that we have. So what I would tell students, and again, this is advice that's I think good for everyone, is like if you feel really angry about something when you see it on social media, it would behoove you to take a beat and evaluate and ask yourself, why am I so angry? Why am I so angry about this? Take a step back before you share, before you comment, before you engage with it. Try to understand what it is about that that's making you angry. And by stepping back and kind of like observing that emotion that you're having in that moment, it gives you a moment to then examine the content of that in a way that's a little bit more emotionally neutral than getting angry and smashing the share button and spreading it all over the place, right? So like I would say it understanding your own emotional condition as you're consuming these things is extraordinarily important. So that's something that we talked about a lot in class, because you do see the far-ranging impact of social media on mental health in students. So like even like subtract out the political stuff. You have a lot of kids who are exposed to things on social media, and I think it's a lot worse today than it was even like 4 years ago when I was teaching the class, where you're exposed to stuff that's extraordinarily detrimental to mental health, whether that's young women being exposed to these sort of totally irrational standards for what it means to be a young woman, young men too, exposed to all sorts of detrimental content about what it means to be what masculinity means, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a provider, so whatever it is you want to throw in there. So, um, it's a really scary situation I think that we have here, because like again, scrolling through my feed, right, I am exposed to all sorts of stuff that like I use this example frequently because it was just so egregious, but it was the people who said it were very serious about it. So there were two guys in a podcast. Hopefully, I don't get in trouble for saying this, but um, and I think the gist of it was basically the one guy was like, if you're 25 years old and you haven't figured out how to buy a Lamborghini yet, you're not doing it right. And I was like, I don't know, like that's how many Lamborghinis are sold in the United States every year, right? You're probably, it's an infinitesimal amount. And then how many of those are sold to people who are under 25 years old? Realistically, almost none. And but what that does is it sets up this standard for living, right? Like someone that you admire that has a microphone in front of them, then they're in a nice set in the podcast and they sound authoritative. Maybe they've got the nice watch on, maybe they have the Lamborghini. Um, or rent one. And then I have a funny
Yeah.
story about that too, actually. But but you can create this whole persona for yourself on social media and then present it to people, and then without the context or tools to evaluate that as a student or a young person. You could very easily buy into that. Like, well, if I just hustle enough and take enough ice baths and, do all this other, stuff that these guys are telling me to do, I should be able to have all this money to buy the nice watch, to buy the Lamborghini, to live the life that I feel like I should be able to live. But what happens is because we both know that that's not necessarily realistic for everybody. Like you can live a very comfortable life in this country and not own a Lamborghini. That you become resentful if you don't get there. And then you start externalizing that anger and pointing it at other people. Because it's like, well, I was told that if I did all of this, that I would succeed. And then you're told, right? So then it's sort of, you go down the rabbit hole. So then you're told on social media, well, if you can't get to this and you hustled and you did whatever you could, someone else's fault. Someone else is taking this from you. And that's wrong. Some other group of people, for young men, you hear a lot about, it's like, oh, young women, they're bad, they're surpassing you in socioeconomically and education attainment. So it's a pretty scary situation. So that was something that we talked a lot about, was like just having the context and tools available personally to the students to evaluate the things that they're seeing on social media in a way that helps, again, contextualize all of that. And it is kind of interesting. So we did some research, again, in a political context, but it was some online polling that we had done. So we surveyed, I think it was like 3,000 or so under 30-year-olds about social media. And I think young women generally appeared, at least in that data, to be 13 points less likely to buy into what they were seeing on social media, whereas young men are 13 points more likely to buy into or feel like the lifestyles that they see on social media are attainable for them. Um, and again, given the stuff that I see on social media, I don't know what everyone else's feeds look like, but I mean, I hear a lot of the same stuff, that you're exposed to some pretty toxic stuff that, like, again, if you don't attain that, you're going to feel pretty resentful. So we talk a lot about that, and then also kind of understanding then as a practitioner in the social media space, as you're developing campaigns for whether it's a brand, whether it's a politician, public figure, asking the question of like, should we be doing this, right? Like, I mean, it might sell more stuff, but is it the right thing to do? Is it like a sustainable thing to do? What are you trying to do? So again, like you see on social media all the time, like people selling courses, for example, like all these guys, again, you should be able to buy that Lamborghini, and I'm going to tell you how. Just have to buy my course,
Right.
and then we'll do a mastermind in the woods for like $10,000. We'll bring you out to the retreat, and we'll eat steak and beat each other up in the woods, and then call it. I mean, like I've seen stuff like actually like that where it's you do sort of to reference Seinfeld, like feats of strength or something. In like a log cabin somewhere, and then all of a sudden you're going to be wealthy, and you're gonna have a head on your shoulders that enables you to attain all of these things that you're told you should be able to attain. And at the end of it, you'll have spent a ton of money, and what kind of value do you get out of it? So anyway, a lot of it was about providing that context and the tools to evaluate things, and then the context and the tools to deploy an ethical framework that I think hopefully led them in a better direction, as they were moving into the social media space professionally.
Yeah, I often talk to people about sort of this idea that if you are triggered like that, um, you're starting to get angry, that's probably a good time to ask, am I really getting the full picture here? Because often people think, well, it's disinformation or it's misinformation. Okay, that's possible. But it's also just like there's some context missing. Like there might be more of this story, or maybe just exaggerated a little bit or framed a certain way. And I think that's as often as anything else, is that just is just a poor framing of this reality. And then, again, I think that's a tool where AI could be helpful both manually, like, and some of these AI tools could really help with that. You could ask this question, like, are they really eating cats in whatever town, right? Or whatever, or something like that. Or did so and so really do this thing? And then we could bring up some context for us. Yeah, or some, maybe context isn't even the right word, but just sort of like, yeah, this happened, but it was also framed around this. And then you can decide, like, should I be outraged about this? Maybe I should be. Like, maybe it really is a thing I should be outraged about. But maybe it's like, it happened one time in this one place in Norway once, and it's not really a it's not really a thing, but and so maybe I don't need to worry about it that much. And I think that's a place where people could both manually do that, just like I think these AI tools could accommodate that kind of thing, but integrated with some of this could be really good too. Like you even talked about, like, I'm going to react right away. Well, maybe the social media or the AI could be as simple as, hey, it's only been about 30 seconds. Are you sure you want to reply to this? Maybe sit on it for an hour, or whatever, right?
I
But
like that. I like that idea. Yeah.
stuff like that. So in an ideal world, to wrap up with some hope here, um, what do you hope political messaging, looks like in the future? What would be your kind of ideal way of what that would look like? And are there any examples of folks doing something in, maybe a healthier, more constructive way of doing it already?
Yeah, I mean, I think the hope, and this is, probably pretty universal. Again, you hear about this desire to reduce polarization, to reduce the acrimony in our politics, and I think that, um, so my hope would be to see more, sort of hopeful messaging. And I think we saw a fair amount of that during, this campaign cycle. The Harris campaign, I think, talked about a lot of, positive vision for the country, in a way that was pretty hopeful. Well, obviously balancing that with some of the contrast that needed to happen. But the hope would be that, for me, that both parties continue to reaffirm their commitment to the fact that, like, again, elections matter, right? Like, and I think that's extraordinarily important to continue to do that and to say it over and over again, like a broken record. Like, elections matter, votes matter. We want as many people in this country, citizens of this country, to vote, and to participate in our civic process, and to develop policy frameworks that sort of foster that. So I would say that is, an area where, I hope, we hear more messaging from, both parties. And again, I think, Democrats have been touching on that, though a little bit more, from a contrast perspective. This is what could happen, if we don't. So, like, my hope is that the environment overall permits that sort of thing, in the futures. And I think that, ultimately we can get there, because, like, at the end of the day, it's like, yes, the leadership does have leadership of the parties. They do have the agency to lead and to set the tone for the country. But we also as voters have agency in this process as well. Like, we can vote, we can decide who we want to have in office, we can decide what sort of policies that we want. But we have to participate, right? Like, and I think that could even filter down to the local level, right? If you want something to change in your town, you can show up to a town council meeting. But I can't tell you how many town council meetings or city council meetings you show up to. No one's there. No one's there, but they're on Facebook, very upset about something. It's like, well, you show up, participate, run. You could run for office too. So I think there are all sorts of ways that I'm hopeful, that we will um, see some improvement in the political messaging environment. But I would say, like, in terms of a message, I would hope to see that reaffirmation of, the importance of democracy over and over and over again, until, and until it's not even a question that we're going to have, elections every single year, and that they're going to matter, and that people can participate. So that would be my hope, um, for the future.
Hmm. So, yeah, sorry about that. uh, yeah. So I was regarding that. I was also going to say that I don't know if you know about or saw the Spencer Cox. He's a Republican in Utah, and they were doing some campaigns a while back where they sort of he got together with his opponent, and said some of these things like, "Hey, we disagree on these issues, but this person they're a good person, and we both, support democracy. Um, we both support, things like free and fair elections and respecting the outcome of elections and things like that. So I don't know where that went or how that played, but to some of what you're speaking to is a little bit of that demand thing we keep talking about too. Like the electorate or the populace seems to kind of want a lot of this kind of messaging. And until we sort of tell them we don't want it, they're going to keep doing it. Or, we show that it's not effective, that they're going to keep doing it.
100%. Yeah. I mean, he's a great example of someone who does not seem afraid. And again, I don't agree with him much on a lot of policy, but
Right.
I think he has been extraordinarily, well, I should say, brave and it's kind of crazy to say bold in asserting his commitment to democracy in that way, right? And I think that he has been actually a very positive voice generally for um, you know ha having strengthening our political system, right? But that in and of itself is kind of a political risk that he's taking for himself, because again, people kind of want to see some of the more inflammatory stuff, but that
Right.
you have to hand it to people like him, even like Mitt Romney to some extent, people like that who have Liz Cheney, people who have stepped up to say like, look, like we do not want this in our country. Like, do we agree with the Democrats on policy? No, but like we have to coexist in a certain way. And guess what? We have elections to work out our differences. Like that's how we work out our differences in this country is we vote, and then that's it. And then you get another chance.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Yep. I know. And right. And there's other aspects as well, like believing the other side thinks rationally, right? If we lose that too, like we think they're just so crazy they can't even think rationally, then we also find ourselves in a situation, or we think that they also have an equal belief in these fundamental principles. Like it becomes imbalanced. If you think the other side, is going to cheat, then you're more likely to cheat, right? I mean, it's kind of a prisoner's dilemma type of thing.
Sure. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Matthew Krayton, I really appreciate you making the time. I know we ran a bit long, but do appreciate you making the time, and I appreciate those insights.
Thank you. Thanks for having me on.